All right, this is your Gaza War Sit Rep day 142. And once again, no end in sight. And I should say no end in sight in particular, because there is some more ceasefire misinformation being spread by Israel. They're saying we submitted a proposal and it's very good and we're close to a deal. I saw that on the internet today, and I don't think it's true. And in fact, Hamas has said they're spinning a web of delusion, or spinning a web that's got nothing to do with reality. Uh, the ceasefire talk they're saying has nothing to do with anything we have seen.
Yeah, and
Basically,
it takes days for those messages to get um,
yeah.
to where they need to be. So the fact that they proposed it yesterday and the media picks it up and covers it is a separate thing from communicating with the resistance.
Just a distraction from so many things to distract from. There have John, you are the authority on videos. So let me, I'm sure, I don't know if you're going to break this video down, but there's a video that I saw of Al Quds Brigade, and they are doing sniper attacks on 6 soldiers, and you sort of watch these soldiers falling. Um, and it looks, I don't know, the video shows one sniper firing 6 times, and usually when they get hit, they run. So it's quite a stunning video to see in a lot of ways. I don't know if you have any comment on that video.
Mujahideen brigades, not Al-Aqsa Martyrs brigades. Yeah, Dragunov sniper attack. It's tough to confirm. It sure looks like they're dropping them.
Yeah.
Um, I guess they would drop down if there was gunshots. The Dragunov is a multiple. You can fire multiple rounds from it, although
Hmm.
you ought not to if you're sniping, but
Yeah.
they do. So yeah, it looked like yeah. I mean, the thing about the Qassam videos is that you actually can verify almost all of them, and so when I do it on the show on Electronic Intifada, I don't just show any video. I make sure that
Yeah.
it's not like wise editing or what's the word? Creative editing.
Now,
Um,
speaking of getting creative, uh, I noticed on John Elmer's Twitter feed, um, this one, Qassam versus IDF in Khan Yunis, including strikes on 2 M113 variants. This is not a Namur APC. This is not an armored personnel carrier. And we've been asking this question for months. When is
mhm.
Israel going to run out of armored vehicles?
February
And
25th.
and I think, yeah, I think this is a sign. Why are they using a 1960s model armored personnel carrier? Why would they do that? And I mean, so quietly to do that, right? Like they did. I didn't see anything on the Israeli side talking about this. This is because there's a resistance video of them hitting this
Absolutely.
vehicle.
And the Israelis all like publicly know about this because in 2014, when my allusion in that tweet is
Hmm.
to the beginning of the ground invasion in the 2014 war, when Israel moved into Shujaiya on the east of Gaza City, and immediately were hit in an ambush. And it was in one of those M113s. And that's when Qassam captured a soldier. And at the time, we had believed that they had captured multiple soldiers. And it was a huge story in Israel. And it was a story that kind of like shaped Israeli military planning because they needed to rush into service their better armored personnel carriers, their Namur personnel carriers. Because people in Israel were mad that their conscription army got sent into battle in insufficient gear. And so to see that today, uh, though those like when I said 10 times thicker, it's actually way more than that. It's like 20 times the capacity of a
Yeah.
Yasin is 20 times thicker, can go through 20 times the thickness of that armored vehicle. So you've got Israelis being sent into Khan Yunis I don't know if it's just arrogance that they believe. I don't know what that is, but I wouldn't go in that vehicle. If my commander told me to go to Khan Yunis in that vehicle, the news story would be about a confrontation within my unit because
Mutiny.
there's no way I'm going in there
You,
in that
you
thing.
don't get arrogant in month 5. That's not how arrogance works.
No, I
You
think you run out of armored vehicles.
That's what it looks like. That's what it looks like.
I don't know how you could spin that honestly, any other way. There's no military need to send those, and those guys are not. If those vehicles were full of troops, those soldiers are no longer with us.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of event though, right? Like in Israel, it's sometimes it's these events. Like in Lebanon, it was when one of their helicopters was
Hmm.
shuttling troops and it crashed. And it's a huge story in Israel with the conscription army because essentially a plane crash is your fault. And so it's kind of it targets it hits the community in a different way than combat
Hmm.
deaths. So it's
Hmm.
very surprising footage to see today. And I'll break it
Strange.
down on Wednesday on Electronic Intifada. You guys should tune in noon
Yeah.
on Wednesday.
Okay. We have on the Yemen front our absolute favorite public speaker, Yahya Sari. You guys, I know I've said this before, but this guy is amazing. I can't, I don't want to play it and have you listen, but this guy's delivery, I mean, there's nothing like it. He's earnest and he's amazing. So the Yemeni armed forces targeted the American Torm Thor ship in the Gulf of Aden with a number of anti-ship missiles. They didn't say the result, but they certainly announced that they made that attack.
And he speaks every time they launch an attack, which is a nice
Yeah.
touch.
There's another. I don't mean to give too much of a preview of Soldiers in a Window, but do you want to say anything about the latest Soldiers in a Window video?
Just they just continue to do it. It's an entire theme.
Soldiers in a Window.
Those
Uh,
that's
that
those three soldiers aren't here anymore either. So
that's Khan
we
Yunis. They
saw,
got hit by a rocket propelled or a TBG, right?
yeah, thermobaric. So that's a fuel air weapon that
Yeah,
you you would want to not survive. Like surviving
yeah,
would be worse than.
yeah,
And then we saw those two troop carriers, which could have had 15 to 20 people in them
yeah.
combined.
Really, really big day of casualties.
Yeah, if
Uh,
you include the Mujahideen brigades, if that video is true that they were dropping those guys with sniper fire,
yeah.
we're going to really see if people want to track it about how Israel lies about its casualties, because
Mhm.
there's just no other way to spin those. I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't know how you
see,
could spin.
there
The
have
only
been
thing you could say
trickle.
is that they're empty. Like, oh, the two troop carriers were empty by the
In which
guys who
case,
were.
you're just driving them around Khan Yunis, taking a tour. They did trickle out a couple. I saw, some younger guys, 20, 21-year-old
Yeah,
sergeants, major, a 24-year-old major.
yeah, the reserves are gone, so the soldiers um, should
Career.
be, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
okay, so yeah, lots of operations in Gaza. This is the summary. There's lots of operations in Khan Yunis and in Gaza City, Zaytun neighborhood in Khan Yunis, and really, really big, I mean, big casualty events. And um, like with these mortar operations, we mentioned it a couple days ago, but they're the end of that video, one of those videos that we just looked at, like there's like plumes of fire. They're
Oh, that
monitoring
was
the
a barrel bomb. That the on the one
oh
video, the Qassam video today, they remotely detonated a barrel bomb that looked like, and that's the next stage of the guerrilla war is spectacular attacks, right? That take time to place, that need the Israelis to be in position for days. They need to be coordinated, but then they set up these massive attacks, and I mean, that's the way that they drove the Israelis out of Gaza. in the Intifada was tunnel bombs buried underneath their troop positions that can take time, but then you can basically stuff them with as much explosives as you can fit, and that's what a barrel bomb is. They use that term to describe essentially just filling something up with as much explosives as you can, and setting it off. So these are a different kind of qualitative attack that will happen if the Israelis plan on sitting in the buffer zone,
Mhm.
or sitting in Zaytun, which is cutting the Gaza Strip in half. These kind of operations will lead to these massive operations and spectacular operations, and these are the types of operations that the Israeli public, which is all weekend, were protesting, and they had water cannons in the street of Tel Aviv,
Horses.
horses attacking protesters. So this is something to watch, because we remember that Israel was involved in effectively uh, like a de facto uh, democratic civil war, where half the population supported a judicial overhaul that would take the power away from an independent judiciary, and basically half that don't, that want that, right? So there's half that want it, half that don't, and they decided to kind of put their differences aside when October 7th happened. But those that aside is like the families of the captives are leading these demonstrations, the ones in Tel Aviv. And then did you see the bouncy castle outside of Erez?
Yeah.
Like they
Uh,
turned their rave into a bouncy castle. They're just so demented.
but
Um,
you guys, the demonstration, they're beating people from horseback. It's like
yeah.
it's not like the demonstrations at the border where they're policed with kid gloves. These
Yeah,
are
let in. They're the ones at the border. They're let in there by the
yeah.
army. No, those they made that demonstration illegal. Those horses came up with on a loudspeaker and said this demonstration's illegal, and basically started attacking people.
Um
So
yeah.
lots to watch.
Um Ehud Olmert, he says we need a ceasefire. He says Israel needs a ceasefire now, and we can't do anything to Iran. And um,
Ex-con.
it's kind of defeatist, sounding a little defeatist.
Yeah, Ehud Olmert is he's going to make another appearance later in the show when we do the PA.
Mm.
But Ehud Olmert went to
He's
jail
always
after he
running.
left office.
He's always running his mouth, isn't he? That he's always saying things they don't like to hear.
Well, he was the one who Sharon got to float the trial balloon about the
Mhm.
disengagement from Gaza to see how people would react to it. And he gave the speech, maximum Jews, minimum Arabs. And the basics of that speech was that we have too many, we if we have one person, one vote, like a democratic state, it won't be a Jewish state. And if we don't give Palestinians the vote, then it's apartheid. So we basically have to act, and that's what they did after the Intifada, the second Intifada. They walled off Palestine, created a ghetto, which I think this is going to effectively be part two of that show. So if
Yeah,
people are listening to this and didn't see part one on Friday, you should go back and listen to that, because we're going to build on that.
it's called
Because
Day
the
One.
siege was implemented, but it needs the PA, it needs the Palestinian Authority to
Yeah.
function.
Okay, and the last thing though, John, that I wanted to cover was that there has been a massive Israeli intelligence revelation. They actually discovered a letter from Yahya Sinwar that says, "I'm very, very angry at Hassan Nasrallah." So, this is one of the major Israeli successes. They found this handwritten letter, and so you know, kudos
The
to them.
the tide is turning. They also
Yeah.
found Hania's expired Visa debit card.
Oh, okay. Were there trillions of dollars of
Well, he's
uh
in Doha, so I don't think he needed it, but they found it, and they bragged about that. That was early in the Khan Yunis operation.
Okay, so they are getting a lot of intelligence.
Well, in the New York Times yesterday, they had a story about Israeli military intelligence talking about how they had basically won the war in the south, except for Rafah, how they'd cleared Khan Yunis. Israeli military intelligence is all over this story, saying there's no more fighting in Khan Yunis. And
Hmm.
then, like the newspaper's not even wrapping fish yet, and there's already a series of videos from Khan Yunis that indicate something like 2 dozen plus casualties. So,
Yeah. And yeah.
okay,
Um,
so I got this one more story. Do you want me to do this?
yeah,
This story is from Al Mayadeen.
yeah,
Informed sources told Al Mayadeen that the Palestinian Authority government will submit its resignation to PA President Mahmoud Abbas tomorrow. The sources added that the current government will carry out its work as a caretaker government. The official source stated that the move was a preemptive one by Abbas in response to international and regional pressures on the PA as a step to stop the war on the Gaza Strip, provide international guarantees for the withdrawal of the IDF, stop the invasions of the West Bank, and lift the financial siege on the PA. The source added, after achieving a cessation of the war, the step will be followed by forming a national consensus among all Palestinian factions, including the Hamas movement. This move comes ahead of the Moscow meeting of all Palestinian factions scheduled for Thursday, February 29th. So that's why we sit rep. We sit rep to prepare you for these kind of messages. Because
yeah,
we talked about Moscow last show,
yeah,
and then here we go. It's handed right to us, right on the day that we're going to do the PA. We get this story from. So we'll
yeah,
see. We'll see what I mean. PA is famous for resigning. Saib Erekat,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
famously the head of the peace process delegations, famously uh, 8 times resigned.
yeah,
So
yeah. It's one of the most symbolic gestures and one of the most potentially meaningless gestures. But I mean, it's a news item, and it's a news item about our
our
historical
topic.
subject of today.
That's a segue right there.
That's a segue if there ever was one. So we have to talk about. So we've done sit reps talking about why Egypt has been so anti-Palestinian. We've done a sit rep on Syria and the price that Syria has paid for not kind of dropping the Palestine issue. We just did a sit rep on the siege of Gaza. So I'm kind of trying to set up a series of pieces so that people can understand the fact that it's a system of alliances that Israel has that underpins its ability to attack the Palestinians with impunity. It's because it has alliances with Jordan, Israel, and with the Palestinian Authority that enables them to progressively isolate Palestinian resistance and try to destroy them. And um, that's why today we wanted to talk specifically about the Palestinian Authority, which is the organization that governs the West Bank, no longer governs Gaza, and why, despite continuous attacks, assassinations, invasions, incursions into the Al Aqsa Mosque, why the Palestinian Authority continues to support Israel. And that's like the mysterious question that we're going to answer today. And it's a mystery probably none of you knew, or not a lot of you probably knew was needed to be. It's the question nobody knew they needed answered, but you do need an answer for this question. So the Palestinian Authority came from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. The PLO was founded in 1964 with the Palestinian National Covenant and it is about establishing a Palestinian state. Um, I don't know. I don't think it says anything about where exactly, but the idea was that Israel is a colonial um, thief of Palestinian land, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization exists to liberate Palestine. This was the time. This is 1960. It's the 1960s. It's anti-colonialism. It's pan-Arab ideology. Nasser is the leader of Egypt. There's alliances of Arab countries that are trying to reverse the colonial takeover of Palestine. And the 1967 war is a big defeat. I talked about that in the Sit Rep, where we talked about Egypt. And the Palestinian Liberation Organization has to kind of reorganize. And there's a struggle in the movement among the Arab nationalist movement about like where the Palestinian Liberation Organization fits, because they're are they subordinate to Egypt? Are they subordinate to Nasser? Are they an equal partner, since they're the most affected? And so there's a lot of internal intra-Arab issues, and the Palestinian guerrilla movements, when they're attacking from Israel from Jordan just shortly after 1967, 1970, there's basically a kind of a civil war in Jordan, where the king of Jordan successfully crushes the Palestinian movement and forces them to leave. They become headquartered from the 70s in Lebanon. Lebanon, I talked about in the context of Syria. There's a civil war in Lebanon starting in the 70s, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization factions are part of that. They're a party to that. And 1982, they're forced to leave again as part of this negotiation. This was all covered in the Sit Rep on Syria. By the time the first intifada happens, that's around 1987. And that's like a big national movement inside all of the occupied territories, the West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza. And they are trying to overthrow the occupation of their lands, the territories occupied in 1967, through people power, like strikes and demonstrations and all of those. And Israel responds the way you would expect, through incredible violence and brutality, but they're forced to start a negotiation process because the resistance does not let up. And they start a negotiation process there's a whole bunch of meetings and a whole bunch of things, and they negotiate with the faction that's left, that's not in the West Bank and Gaza, the Arafat led faction of the PLO that are based in Tunis at this time. And so what the Palestinian Authority negotiates, what the Arafat party negotiates, is basically they get to go back to the West Bank. They get some kind of capital in Ramallah. They get subcontracted authority, municipal authority to control their population, and all other issues like the right of return, actual statehood, international representation, economic issues, control of water, freedom of movement. All of these issues are going to be settled later. And so they agree to that, and that becomes the Oslo Accords of 1993. And
but later is only 5 years later. The state was supposed to exist under the Oslo Plan by the mid 90s. And so the key difference is, like what you said, is that the before the first Intifada in 1987, the Palestinian armed struggle and the major organizing body of the Palestinians is in exile. And so the Intifada is the bridge between the people, the leadership in exile, the PLO, and the indigenous resistance that's trying to throw off the occupation. And the Islamist currents are a more recent phenomena and are not in the PLO, despite the PLO having roughly representation across the political spectrum. Because of the timing of the Islamist movements end up being at the vanguard of the people were at the vanguard, but then the Islamist movements realized that they had to respond to the people. And that's when Hamas is formed out of the Brotherhood as a resistance organization, which had previously um, post- postponed the armed struggle point of their movement, because Hamas and the Hamas movement, before it was Hamas, is building an infrastructure, a Dawa infrastructure in the Palestinian territories that looks after people. That's a social program, and they're waiting for when to decide to become an armed struggle group, which is why Islamic Jihad uh, exists separate from Hamas, because Fatih Shakaki, who led Islamic Jihad in the 80s, said it's time for action. And the people who would become Hamas, um, like Sheikh Yassin, said, no, the time's not right now to start the Islamist wing. So Islamic Jihad splinters off from the Islamist movements and becomes, from that point on, a very focused, action-based group. So when people ask what the difference between Islamic Jihad and Hamas is, it's a question that roots back to the beginning about whether there should be action now or whether you continue to build your foundations out. And because of that split, the PLO in exile, the resistance indigenously, and then the Islamists catching up locally creates this dynamic where Oslo kind of sneaks in uh, inside of this sort of split, and creates the fundamental split. And the reason why the PLO accepted the PA was because all of these fighters got to come home. Part of the
Right.
PA, the first steps of the PA was giving control of Gaza, municipal control of Gaza, to the Palestinians, Gaza and Jericho. Um, and so these fighters come home, and they come home with their weapons. So that's the three currents happening: an indigenous resistance. The Islamist is an indigenous resistance as well, but it doesn't begin the Intifada. When the Intifada breaks out, they realize that now's the time that they have to act, and that's one of the reasons why the infamous Hamas charter, um, it comes out of that time where basically a few guys in the Gaza Strip wrote a communique to explain who they were. It's not that different than the Houthis explaining where they came up with their chant from, right? Like, it came
Mhm.
out of a moment. They weren't thinking about whether this should be a lifetime. The Hamas charter wasn't intended to be a lifetime charter. Um,
Yeah.
it was kind of a spur of the moment thing, because the Intifada broke out, and the Islamist movements. I mean, the Islamist movements in some ways started the Intifada. Islamic Jihad, in a lot of ways, started the Intifada with their indigenous resistance in Gaza. They broke out of prison in Gaza and went. They broke out of Israeli prison in 1987, and then went the six fighters and went and hid out in Gaza and attacked Israeli forces. And there was a big battle in Shujaiya just before the December Intifada begins. A big battle, one of the first big battles, armed struggle battles, happens in with Islamic Jihad fighters who broke out of prison, and it creates this flame that ultimately becomes a nonviolent um, demonstrations. But in a lot of ways, the armed struggle led to that. So That's the context at this point. So now we're in the early 90s, and
Yeah.
Israel starts peace negotiations publicly at a conference in Madrid with legitimate Palestinian representatives sent to Madrid. And they go and this is the first peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis. And the Israelis realize, like, there's no way we can do these public negotiations because these leaders are legitimate in the eyes of their people, and they actually want real concessions to their at that point, what, 50 years of displacement. And so Israel calls off the public negotiations that are in the newspapers and have a delegation like Haider Abdel Shafi, who's like a very well-respected Palestinian man who created the Palestinian Red Crescent. He's the person negotiating, somebody who's, universally respected within the society. And so Israel calls that off. They say, there's no way we're doing this. And they shift it to back rooms. They shift it to Mahmoud Abbas. They shift it away from an actual peace agreement to becoming this kind of staged thing where one stage, then the next stage. And if this happens, then that happens, and really muddy the waters so that the Palestinians are left in a position where when Oslo is announced, this peace plan is announced, it's a secret, and the Palestinians are enraged by it.
Yeah, and why are they enraged? What is it? What is the Palestinian movements think of Oslo as a disaster, and it is
All people
because
do.
yeah, all
Any
people
living
do.
room, any room that you sat in Palestine, they would think that. And Arafat had to say, it had to be Arafat because he was someone respected, and he had to constantly tell people, no, 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 there's good parts to this. Don't worry, we're gonna, this at first, and then so they were able to sort of celebrate some of the things, like they were able to celebrate somewhat like municipal autonomy, and Arafat comes from exile and goes back and lives in Gaza. So there are things that look like success. One of the other things that we'll talk about later more is that they bring their security forces. And Israel tells them that these security forces are to protect, effectively to protect Israel. But at the time, the fighters that were coming home were not collaborators. They were not collaborators. They were fighters who lived in Jordan, lived in Lebanon, lived in Tunis, and fought. And so they were able to come home, many of whom had legitimacy. They didn't come home as collaborators. The collaborator
Yeah,
stuff really takes
but
time to unfold.
but the deal,
The deal.
like the deal with Egypt, it's not unlike the Camp David Accord in the sense that the main effect of the deal is to bring this gigantic problem for Israel, this leadership of the Palestinian Liberation Organization into the Israeli camp. They're on Israel's side now. And the result of that is all of the other allies, everybody else in the world that might have thought, we support Palestinian liberation, they can't because that would make them more Palestinian than the Palestinians, right? So part of the reason, I was lamenting the fact that Russia and China aren't doing anything more than they're doing. They're doing very much, even on the humanitarian file. But how can they? Because their official dealings are with the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority is the big slogan of the PLO, the big fight that they had was the phrase, this is the big phrase, the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people.
Yeah,
And they kept using that phrase.
that's the
and
phrase.
and the United States throughout the 70s and 80s said, we will not recognize the Palestinian Liberation Organization. We will not talk to the Palestinian Liberation Organization unless they renounce violence and recognize the state of Israel. recognize Israel's right to exist. These were the conditions. So, I always make this analogy to Hamas, where they just made impossible conditions that to continue rejecting any kind of deal, any kind of peace, any kind of agreement, and to deny the Palestinian leadership legitimacy, whoever they are. So now it's Hamas, and Hamas can't do anything. Hamas has to just cease to exist. They want to go. They're open about just, we're going to go and kill all of Hamas. That's not even, there are no longer any conditions on Hamas that Hamas could fulfill to make a deal, even as they're dealing with them. But the PLO signed this deal, which means all of Palestine's allies have to go along with this. Everybody should go along with this. And then the leader of the PLO, the leader of the Fatah faction, Arafat, he sets up in Ramallah he has like the equivalent of a presidential compound in Ramallah, and
in Gaza first.
In Gaza first, yeah, and there's an airport, and then over the next 7 years, the Israelis continue to build and expand settlements in the areas that are supposed to be the Palestinian state. They have settlements in Gaza, they have settlements in the West Bank, and they have settlements in Jerusalem. And they're demolishing. These were the big issues. I mean, it's strange to talk about in this context that we're living in now, where they're starving hundreds of thousands of people, murdering tens of thousands of children, and destroying every single building. But they used to demolish people's homes in Jerusalem. I mean, they still do, but like home demolitions, where they would demolish Palestinians' homes on various pretexts and then give that land to settlers. That was like the modality during the Oslo years of gradually encroaching. And so throughout the 90s, it was Arafat having less and less to show for the Oslo Accords, and the gradual building of rage among Palestinians who were wondering what this deal really had accomplished for them.
Because Oslo wasn't a signed final product. So the way that they laid out Oslo was that there was all of these stages, and each of these stages had to be signed and agreed to. So each time a new stage would come up, Israel would say, we're not signing that. We're not signing this stage. And they would just drag their feet on these. So the whole thing was just written as a scam, basically. And one of the things that the PA has done to try to address that, like this sort of Edward Said sort of said, like, that the Palestinians didn't even have, they were from exile, right? They're negotiating Oslo from exile. They never been to the West Bank. They didn't even have a map of the West Bank, infamously, at these negotiations. So Israel basically just had their way. And so one of the things that the PA tried to address in the sort of second generation of the PA is to have these lawyers that act as part of the negotiations unit now. And that's where people like Diana Butu and some people in the legal profession were part of this negotiating unit that was made up of lawyers. And that's what the PA brags about now, saying, that the negotiating team is now full of map makers, and lawyers. But at the time when they signed away Palestinian rights, they didn't have any of that. So Israel entrenches their occupation in the West Bank, and asks the PA to effectively police their territories, which in the 90s means attack Hamas.
The other notorious thing is about Oslo is these areas A, B, and C. Yeah. So area A is where Palestinians are sort of free, would you say, under self-government? So you can see the black territories in this map.
I don't know about free, because like Hebron is a divided place, right. Like these, and Gaza has settlements at this time in it, so they're deadly places. But effectively municipal control over that black territory, like those little tiny splotches. And that's
Yeah.
the thing that the negotiating team, that Abbas, in negotiating Oslo, they didn't know these kind of nuances that Israel had been building for 50 years, all into maps, because to create their state, Israel relied on maps, because they went around, as soon as they took over, they went around and changed the names on everything. All the street names, all the mountain names, all the village names, all got renamed. And Israel understood right from the beginning that these maps and the way that you parcel off the territory will actually be more important than any negotiation that goes on. And so when Oslo starts, um, Sharon and Netanyahu, the right wing, Netanyahu goes and Sharon goes and speaks to settlers, and he says, "Go run, take all the hilltops." That's why they're called the Hilltop Youth. The settlers run, and he says, "Go grab whatever land you can, because anything you don't grab now is going to become part of a Palestinian state." So it was that conscious of literally telling people to go out and take hilltops, to make de facto, like to make what they call facts on the ground, to make the lived reality completely irrelevant, to make the negotiated deals completely irrelevant to the lived reality, that you create
Area
these physical structures.
Area B is these villages, and then Area C is the Israeli controlled.
Yeah,
Uh,
so Sharon said, "Go take all that striped land." That's the land that he says to take. And you can see in the blue, with the blue triangles there, you can see the way the settlements, that's the same, they function the same way as the Gaza envelope. The settlements cut the West Bank in half. You can see, to cut Nablus from Ramallah, um, to cut all the major, they just create little islands,
Islands,
ghettos.
exactly. This is a very well made map in that sense, because it shows
Yeah.
blue. It's like you see Israel. Israel is the sea, and Palestinians live on small islands, and they are not allowed to travel to one another. So, um, the
And if you showed
connected.
anyone that map in the New York Times, right, the whole debate would completely change if you just simply showed that map to people. But they never
Yeah.
do. They just show a map that shows Nablus and Hebron and Ramallah and Jerusalem. They don't show the map with the actual physical realities. They
So,
do now. It's been more something that has come out in after the second intifada, with groups like the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. They put out like really detailed maps, because by the 2000s, the understanding that these maps are actually far more important than any discussion, any of these peace, because they
mhm,
have these ritualistic peace events where
mhm.
people go to some resort town and talk about how there's going to be a slightly different look to the map. But none of those things matter compared to the
The resort in Egypt you're talking about.
yeah, well, they do them. Yeah, they did
Taba
them in
Accords.
Taba. They did them in, yeah, Sharm el Sheikh. They do them at Camp David. Uh,
Maybe we should do that. We should go to a resort. So, um, okay. Is there anything we need to do before we get to 2000 and the second
well, they don't
Intifada?
start as collaborators, and that's an important part to say, is that Arafat plays all sides against each other, right? And so the Israelis are coming to Arafat right away and saying, essentially, arrest Mohammed Deif, the leader of the Qassam brigades, arrest Yahya Ayash, the principal bomb maker and leader of the Qassam brigades. And Arafat and Dahlan say no, and they pretend, they say, the famous one about Deif uh, is that Dahlan and him are neighbors in Khan Yunis. And so they go to this meeting, and the Israelis are telling Dahlan to arrest Deif. And Dahlan says, "Who?" Pretends he doesn't know who he's talking about. And so they kind of play both sides. Israel tells them to arrest Hamas people, And sometimes Arafat says that he arrested Hamas people to actually protect them from the Israelis who are going to kill them. So and then at the time, the PA security forces are the fighters from abroad. So they believe that they have a legitimacy in the public that isn't as collaborators. And so to set the tone for the Second Intifada begins with when Sharon marches on Al Aqsa Mosque and the Palestinian population starts demonstrating and Israel starts massacring the demonstrators. It's the PA security forces who shoot back at Israel. And then at the beginning of the Intifada, basically the first day that it breaks out, Marwan Barghouti, who's a Fatah leader, he tells the PA security forces, give us your guns, like either use your guns to fight or give us your guns so that we can redistribute them. So the Second Intifada's weaponry begins by Barghouti redistributing PA guns. So
And
it doesn't start. It's important to say that it's not just a collaborator regime that the Palestinian population said, "Fine, you get to do whatever you want with us." It was a very intricate game that Arafat's playing, playing all sides off, as he did. That was what that. I mean, that was his thing.
brand. Yeah. The other thing is the Israel. So after this, when the Second Intifada starts, and it's provoked. Ariel Sharon basically leads a group of, I don't know, a battalion-sized group of police, 1,500 police, to the Al Aqsa Mosque, and so people start fighting, and there you go, the Second Intifada starts, and what Israel does is a couple of things strategically. They re-invade. This is the words they use. They re-invade the West Bank and Gaza. They go in with armor and a military invasion, Apache helicopters, airstrikes, and then their airstrikes and assassinations. And their airstrikes and assassinations, the first target is these security forces. The first target
is the police stations because
the
they
police.
fight back.
Yeah.
And some of the actual first operations were actually joint because the security in the 90s often was a joint security. So PA went out, like literally went out and patrolled with Israeli security. And there was a number of cases in the early Intifada where the PA guy just literally turned to the Israeli beside him and shot him. So the PA, and then so Barghouti passing out these weapons and the PA participating in the Intifada is an important part of the Intifada. And then once they destroy all the police stations and all the security stations, Arafat lets out of prison the Islamists that he has, the Hamas and Islamic Jihad cadre that he has in prison. He releases them, and that's when the Intifada really gets going. That's when it becomes a real armed struggle because you have PA security forces weapons and you have the cadre and leadership of the Hamas and Islamic Jihad movement that were in prison. So at the beginning of the Second Intifada, the PA is critical in the beginning of the Intifada, and the reason why Sharon marches on Al Aqsa Mosque is that's the death of Oslo, because Oslo was supposed to protect that territory. That's the most basic request, or whatever what the word is, but that's the demand of Palestinians, is to have control over that territory. So um, and it also comes on the heels of Hezbollah chasing Israel out of South Lebanon. So the Palestinians are now, for the first time, seeing Israelis retreating, losing, and they jump on that when Sharon jumps on that to go to Al Aqsa Mosque and basically put a dagger in the Oslo process. So that's why then the PA forces, who didn't want to be collaborators, um, their mandate no longer exists, and it's because Israel destroys it. And they
There's a,
destroy it in part because they participated. Marwan
yeah.
Barghouthi is a critical leader, a pillar of Palestinian leadership, and is one of the people that are talked about that has the life sentences, who Hamas is going to get out of prison in this prisoner exchange. So yeah, so it's not just strictly collaborators. The nuance is important because it's those guns that are used at the beginning of the Intifada.
There's another analogy with Egypt in the sense that Egypt gets this deal to get equipment from the US, but the US makes sure that the equipment that Egypt gets is always the older version, and Israel always gets the newer version. Egypt doesn't get the spare parts. Israel gets the full package of instructors and trainers and all the rest of it. And the Palestinian Authority got guns under Oslo, but the disparity in weapons is immense. And so when Israel goes in to the West Bank and Gaza, they go in like they're going to go to fight Egypt in the Sinai. They're going in like they're going with an arm, fighting an armored combined arms operation against a fully armed military, and they're not. They're fighting police with small arms. And the thing is, the this was, a lot of people, a lot of American military analysts have said this, which is like when you go and do policing with an army, your army eventually ceases to be able to be an army.
Yeah.
And so this is what we are seeing in the guerrilla war in Gaza, which is the Israeli army is used to policing, and it's used to an incredible disparity in weapons, which still exists. They still have a disparity in weapons, but it's not the disparity that they are used to. It's not, you're not invulnerable in armor anymore. You're not, you can't stop
Yeah, the
orders.
Palestinians built an indigenous weapons manufacturing industry that we never see in the Israeli pictures of weapons captured. When they pretended there was weapons
Yeah,
at Shifa, they didn't unveil all of the weapons
yeah,
that the Qassam brigades have built. They unveiled the rusty AK-47s that came back from overseas with the PLO in the
yeah,
1990s. So you're
yeah,
looking at 35-year-old rusty guns. And
yeah.
that's something that we never have. I don't know if I've had a chance to say that yet on air.
I remember you saying something like that. This is the time, though, the war against the camps in Jenin and in Nablus, where they are deploying these things like the bulldozers, and they're bulldozing neighborhoods, and they're doing airstrikes on
Yeah.
residential neighborhoods, and they're just like the slightest, and they're walking through walls, and they have military philosophers. If you read I.L. Wiseman's book, he quotes these military philosophers. Literally, there's like a military philosopher, like he's part of the IDF, and his job is philosopher. I watched The Lab. There's a Israeli movie about the Israeli arms industry called The Lab. Anyway, and
And the
this is
first assassinations were of Fatah people who were part of
mhm,
the Oslo process. So they were very, very just direct messaging by Israel: destroy the institutions of
yeah.
Oslo, and then attack the population as if they didn't have any of the rights that were created by Oslo. Because Oslo's primary right that it afforded the Palestinians was that the Israelis weren't going to come in a mechanized invasion and attack your village. That was what was supposed to at least happen.
So they the second Intifada just kind of keeps going. There's is there I don't know, you may know. Is there an identifiable end of the second Intifada? Do they date it? Because they didn't sign, it didn't end in an accord or an agreement or anything, right?
Well, probably it would be the 2005 withdrawal from Gaza, the disengagement from Gaza would be
Right.
probably the mark. But I usually take it back to 2003 when Ehud Olmert announces this maximum Jews,
Mm.
minimum Palestinians. Because of the suicide bombings, basically they justify building the wall. So they start building the wall in 2003. They start ghettoizing the population. They've already destroyed the institutions of Oslo. Um, and
Yeah.
and the
And the
and the
wall is more or
assassinations
less
are of
complete.
PLO members, right? Like they assassinate Abu Ali Mustafa from the PFLP while he's sitting at his desk in Ramallah at his Palestinian Legislative Council elected desk, and they kill him with a helicopter gunship. So the messaging of the Second Intifada is destroying Oslo, and then Israel's basically their steps, because they've destroyed Oslo. Their steps are unilateral, and that's what we talked about on last show with Dov Glass saying we're going to put the peace process in formaldehyde.
Yeah.
So that's usually I usually take it to there because the window of time between 2004 2005, the Intifada scales down significantly, because the Israelis are basically announced that they're going to withdraw. So there's this sort of like year-long period where um,
Yeah.
there's the attacks are down because they don't necessarily need to do them because they know Israel's leaving. So I would say it ends, the armed struggle ends in late 2003. And then the Intifada is for sure over by 2005. That in 2006 is when they have the election and Hamas
Yeah.
gets elected.
Which we covered. Yeah. But yeah, I wanted to show this because of the wall. Like, people probably, a lot of our viewers understand the wall, but like the wall is not separating Israel from Palestine or separating Israel from the West Bank. It's a wall all around individual communities, and
Yeah,
it,
the
it
wall's around Palestine. It's not around Israel.
and it's
It's up
inside Palestine.
it's inside Palestine. And then in 2004, the World Court issues an advisory opinion saying that the wall is illegal and needs to be taken down. And Israel just ignores that
Yeah.
and sets up the disengagement, takes these unilateral
Yeah.
steps to pull
And
out.
that's the big point about '05 is Israel makes a big deal out of the fact that they are doing all of this without an agreement, and they don't have to have an agreement, and they don't need an agreement. And this is key because they do, because everything that they do depends on these agreements. Everything they do depends on Egypt, Jordan, and the PA following the agreements to the letter that they may or may not follow. And so that's from '05. Well, Arafat keeps playing the game that we've mentioned until he's assassinated. I think we can
I think
safely
that's fair
say
to
he
say.
was assassinated in what was it? Oh 08?
Mm, that's a good question. No, because it was before the Hamas takeover. So it must have been 2006.
2004.
Four.
Wow, 2004. Okay. So 2004, Arafat dies. That's also a major part of the end of the Intifada, the second Intifada. And Arafat dies, and then the person who takes over is
Oslo negotiator Mahmoud Abbas.
Mahmoud Abbas. And Mahmoud Abbas, yeah, why don't I'll over to you, John.
Okay,
I'll
well
let you
then so
talk
then
about Abbas.
2006 the Palestinians have the election that we talked about on the
Mhm.
show last whatever day, I don't know, in 8 days.
Yeah, it
Um,
was
but
Tuesday.
Hamas wins the election throughout the West Bank and Gaza, and they set about making a government, and the PA security forces are essentially the Americans push the Palestinian security forces to not like switch sides, to not transfer power um, during for the new Hamas government. That's in Gaza. And then in the West Bank, an American general, Keith Dayton, comes for the Americans to train new Palestinian security forces because the previous Palestinian security forces were not loyal and ended up being part of the Intifada. So Keith Dayton, this American Marine Corps general, comes to set up Palestinian security forces, and he sets about right away to make a distinction in these forces. So he trains them in Jordan so that they don't have to be in their own communities, where they're not seen as legitimate. So this is the difference, is that this new Palestinian security force that's set up doesn't have any legitimacy in the population, whereas the one in the 90s had at least some sort of nebulous relationship. At this point in 2006, Keith Dayton sets about he even calls them new men, and he reorganizes them, trains them in Jordan, and then instead, like that happened, instead of having them police their own communities, he moves the people. So if you're from Jenin and you join the security forces, you're trained in Jordan, and then you're deployed in Hebron, or not in Hebron because they
It's
can't
like
deploy
the
in Hebron.
if you follow my historical podcast, this was the method used by, for example, the Austro-Hungarian Empire or any other Ottoman Empire to make sure you're not serving garrisoning the community that you're from.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's just very strong. And then they set about making sure openly that they call it Hamas takeover, even though they won elections. They say we're going to try to prevent a Hamas takeover of the West Bank. And so, under Israeli control, these security forces set about brick by brick dismantling what's called the Dawa, which is the social architecture of the Hamas movement. Schools, mosques, community centers are targeted and destroyed. People are arrested and asked who they voted for, because now we have an election where you know Hamas won, so you can actually torture people and say, who did you vote for? People would get tortured by the PA and then released by the PA. The next day, the Israelis come and arrest them and torture them with what, but say that you voted for Hamas. And so they take apart the social apparatus in the West Bank to prevent a takeover. And they have a caretaker government under Salem Fayyad, who in the elections that had just happened, his party won something like 2.8% of the vote. And the Americans and Israelis install him as the leader of the PA. And they use Tony Blair, who comes from the Iraq War, right to the West Bank to set up secure to an economic partnership that goes hand in hand with the security partnership. Salem Fayyad is a neoliberal World Bank IMF official. And so it's a two-part strategy to dismantle the Dawa, and then to reinstitute a new kind of economic plan, essentially so that you can create statistics, because it's a unilateral move by Israel, to create legitimacy for this unilateral move by Israel. They try to create essentially economic statistics, that the Economist magazine can run to show how Palestinians have benefited from having this PA government. So Tony Blair is in charge of that right on the heels of the war in Iraq. So it's not subtle. This is the time that I'm living and reporting on this. So I reported a lot on this Dayton project. And in Gaza, the Dayton project is called the Carney Project. And Carney is the shipping terminal in the north of the Gaza Strip. And essentially, what the goal of Dayton was to have collaborators control the borders, because now that Hamas won elections inside Gaza, and now that the Israelis have pulled out of Gaza, Israel and the U.S. wants to have the borders controlled by the collaborators, not by Hamas. So Dayton's project is actually called the Carney Project,
And that's for
which is
Carney
something
Crossing,
for Carney Crossing.
which is not a crossing
Well, no, it
anymore.
is the crossing. It's the crossing that they don't talk about
But it
right
doesn't. It's
now,
not
because
used
it's
now.
not
Like it's
used, but
yeah.
it could be used, and it has the ability to have proper back-to-back offloading.
Mhm.
Carney is what has to be open for Palestinians to survive, and it's just not. And the only crossing you hear about is Karam Abu
Haram Shalom.
Shalom, yeah, and that's in the south. But Carney is supposed to be the crossing in the north, where the Israelis benefit by selling to Hamas, right? Or selling to the people of Gaza. Because the way
Captive market.
Gaza gets its milk, Gaza gets its milk from Israelis. Gaza gets its washing detergent from Israelis, from Israeli businessmen. This idea that like Israel's letting in aid gives the idea that it's actually like Israeli aid. It's not. It's a monopolistic,
Yeah, it's a captive market.
cartel.
Yeah, it's an absolute captive market, and so is
Like
the West
of
Bank.
2 million people. So it's a significant economic benefit to Israelis.
The other thing, though, or um, the fundamental political economic issue of the Dayton Project is paying the salaries of the security officials and the bureaucrats
Yeah.
and being able to hold that up as needed. And that is the principal, I would say, the principal lever over which over the Palestinian Authority to this day, right? I mean, that's what truly makes them a subcontractor. That's what Abbas means when he says in 2014 that our security cooperation with Israel is sacred. Calls it sacred.
Yeah, because all the other factions are saying end security cooperation. End security cooperation is a basic tenet of all the resistance groups, because it should be the most obvious thing that you would break off relations after.
Step one, after when during a genocide, you can't break security cooperation with the entity that's committing genocide. So
So essentially, the islands that you showed in the previous map, the Israelis and Americans need those islands to be nominally profitable so that you can put statistics in a magazine. And they have to have the ability to secure their own population so that there can be a peace process that happens in place of Oslo. And the Israelis, because of the beginning of the Second Intifada, say there's not going to be Palestinian security forces in the West Bank. They don't want any security forces. And essentially, the Americans convince the Israelis that they'll start from scratch and build a whole new security apparatus in the West Bank. And they're doing this while they're physically building the wall all around the areas. So essentially, they're creating these islands of Palestinian ghettos inside an Israeli state and then calling it a state. And that's what the plan is to ultimately call that the Palestinian state.
and I think now we have a picture of what the PA is now. It's a security force, salaries controlled by Israel, trained and developed in Jordan under American auspices, and existing inside of islands that are walled in, and the matrix in which, or the sea in which these islands exist and float, is militarily controlled by Israel. And
Yeah,
within
and it's
these
further
islands,
complicated by the fact that the PA is also um, the municipal government. So it runs schools and healthcare, it's civil servants, and supposed to be sewage and services like that. And so a lot of it's the main employer, it's the primary employer. So a lot of people's families are tied into this bureaucratic structure that normally in any other state is not doesn't go by the whims of the elections. Parties are elected to lead the state. It doesn't change the school system. But the PA's setup is they made it that way. They made it so that it was one or the other. You're going to destroy the schools that Hamas has set up. And then people, when they talk about disbanding the PA, a lot of people in Palestine hear you're disbanding the school system, you're disbanding the healthcare system, you're disbanding because it's not just security for a lot of people. It's actually the municipal institutions that should remain consistent no matter who the government is. But in Palestine, that's not the case. And it wasn't the case when Hamas won elections. And Fatah told, and the US, they said that Hamas are terrorists, so they can't use any money So the Fatah teachers, the school teachers from the Palestinian Authority, didn't go to work, and they didn't pay the doctors, the Hamas doctors, and so Hamas rebuilt the Gaza Strip over these 15 years, because at the time the PA collapsed in Gaza because they stopped sending the money, they stopped collecting taxes. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
and then
mean, those are the bank robberies, the theft of cash. I mean, all of these things that Israel does to undermine the possibility of a sovereign economy is a whole other.
yeah, Israel collects the tax revenue on behalf of the PA and then doesn't give it to them. So Israel is effectively adding a tax on top of every product going into Palestine and stealing that money,
Yep.
literally.
So now the last point is within these islands, inside of these walls, right now, there is armed uprising against Israel.
Yeah. From north to south,
And
at any given moment, half a dozen armed struggle sites in the West Bank. The West Bank's absolutely on fire. There was something like 3,000 resistance operations in 2023. The resistance was happening even before October 7th in the West Bank, but particularly since. Um, yeah, the West Bank is on fire.
and they
Presumably,
don't,
some of the tanks and armored
yeah.
personnel carriers that should have been in Khan Yunis are now in the West Bank to prepare for Ramadan, and in the
And
north to prepare for
they don't have the
Hezbollah.
same kinds of weapons that they have in Gaza, but they do have improvised explosive devices now and small arms. So, and yeah, who knows? Who knows what's next? I mean,
Which we haven't seen since the Second Intifada.
yeah.
So we just covered 15 years there where a lot goes on, but we didn't see that. We didn't see armed struggle. We haven't seen armed struggle inside the ghettos, which is one of the questions that we have. What does that look like? What does an intifada look like when we from taking place inside what we just described for the last hour of these walled off ghettos that Israel can just close the door and lock, throw away the
Well,
key.
that's a question, right? Can you have a wall without somebody to guard the wall? All right. Well, we should probably stop there. What do you think?
Yep, sounds good. I think that sounds good.
Okay. Like and subscribe and stuff, and we'll be back this week. John will be on when's your
Wednesday at noon on Electronic Intifada live stream. We have John Mearsheimer.
wow. Okay.
So that'll be interesting. And
A little bit
then
of realism, add a little bit of realism to the discussion.
yeah, we're getting IR realists, international relations theory realists in. Oh, it's good. It's interesting. And then I got lots of videos, so I'll break them down as usual. So check us
All
out
right.
on Wednesday at noon Eastern.
Wednesday at noon Eastern.
I believe
Okay.
that's.
I'll probably come in with something before then, maybe Tuesday night or something. But we'll see you next sit rep.
See you guys.